To dismiss the pilgrim processions as naught but blunt instruments of war is to neglect how effective a hammer is at rendering one's face unrecognizable. But also, it is to forget that the processions do not war unaided, for their vanguard is oft formed of the blessedly lethal sisterhood of Stigmatic nuns. For every heretic grunt ruined by a pilgrim's flail, the gaps in a fallen knight's plate are found by a nun's keening sword. For every snap boom of a punt gun into an enemy fortification, a crucifix of sharpened iron flies silently into a spotter's window, launched by the hand of a nun that careens and cartwheels over the trenches with shocking speed. The Stigmatic nuns are in equal parts surgical outflankers and bloodied angels of death, killing with a divine alacrity that is only empowered by the mortal wounds they so readily survive. The most widespread origin of the sisterhood of the Stigmata hails from its oldest order, the Mantelet Sisters of St. Catherine. Born in the early years of the unified church, Catherine of Siena's literary and rhetorical competence belied her age, but it was her mystical visions of union with the Son of God that attracted the minatory gaze of the papacy. Her first vision saw Christ himself visit the young nun, biting her sup from the red honey and iron that trickled from his pierced body. Further encounters over the years included a form of mystical marriage with the Son of God, and numerous theological essays on the sacrificial power of his ever-leaking blood. This not only earned Catherine the title of Apostle of the Blood of Christ, but an ongoing correspondence with Pope Agapetus III, which eventually culminated in a personal summons to the Holy See. As the story continues, it was in the darkest chamber below the Vatican that the would-be saint was brought unto the heavenly and terrible presence of the new Lamb of God. She beheld its divinely contorted form with rapturous awe, an arrangement of oven legs framing a chest heaving with staccato breaths. Perfect sanguine ruin pouring from eyes across the sublime face Catherine had wed in her visions. As if reliving her first encounter with the Redeemer, Catherine lovingly imbibed this new being's seeping wine. Her own vision blurred with bloody tears, her habit dampened by identical, immaculately conceived wounds, and she felt all the strength of the heavenly host. Scholars of the Sororum Stigmata would later attribute this encounter to a prophetic visitation from the third Metachrist, despite records not dating its appearance for generations to come. However, the saint disappeared soon after, leaving behind only a letter detailing her transformative experience, upon which the Mantelet Sisters were founded. St. Catherine's story spread like wildfire throughout Christendom, finding extra purchase at a time where the influence of hell was strongly felt. Convents old and new began scarring their bodies and eyes, reporting feelings of divine strength and conviction that outshone the terror of the corpse wars. However, this also came with an unyielding desire to excise any who failed to meet their standards of piety. After all, when one has suffered as the Lord has suffered, and has felt the transcendent power of his persistence and love, how could one accept that any would doubt him? Many saw these practices as heretical impieties, and the resulting civil unrest led to the excommunication of these newly identified orders of Stigmatic nuns by papal bull in the 15th century. Rather than quash the orders, this merely drove them out of the church and into the wastes of the war. It is here that the sisterhoods found companionship alongside the pilgrim processions, and it was in the violence of the front lines that the sisterhoods found the strength and speed granted by their blessed stigmata, only heightened when the wounds were inflicted by others in battle. Over the centuries, the martial aspect of the sisterhoods of the stigmata became perhaps their most defining characteristic. Novitiates train as much with the sword as they study holy texts in their hidden or ramshackle monasteries. fulfilling their charism by earning the blessed stigmata when fighting the enemies of God. As each sisterhood has their own patron saint, so too do they have their own practices and traditions. The Order of the Ecstasy of St. Teresa emphasizes mortification of the flesh, so as to attain a form of religious ecstasy known as transverberation. As such, they are known to go into battle with the bare minimum of clothing or armour, so that they may earn their divine suffering unhindered. Meanwhile, the Sisterhood of the Saint Hildegard considers their martial aptitude but one of many gifts granted by the Blessed Stigmata, dedicating much of their time to all manner of creative tasks, including scribing musical and literary works. Their research on the mystical language known as the lingua ignota has even attracted the attention of the Synod of Strategic Prophecy. A number of smaller orders honour a centuries-old sacred commitment to the Order of St. Lazarus, forming highly specialised warrior convents at the service of their leper knights, or splintering off to join the many processions of the Sacred Affliction which were once under their protection. In sharp contrast, the convents that fight alongside more orthodox pilgrim processions embrace traditional values of modesty and reject the doctrines of the Metachrist entirely, attributing their miraculous power to divine purpose. Much like the larger pilgrim processions, the Church does not recognize, but rather tolerates, these varying sisterhoods of the stigmata as co-belligerents in the Great War. Yet their more punitive excommunication has not been formally withdrawn, with some of the more patriarchal clergy officials dismissing the orders as no different from other pagan witch cults dabbling in sympathetic blood magic. However, for the princes of the Church that have viewed the papal records concerning the Third Metachrist, they know the truth may be far more complex and troublesome for the unified Church. Alrighty, another pretty sick week of lore, frankly, in the world of Trench Crusade. This week we get to learn all about the Stigmatic Nuns, and we get some new art as well for them. So yeah, this week is really fun. We get some Metachrist mentioning, which I know people are always about, and I'm quite interested in as well, no doubt about it. So first of all, I just want to run through a few bits and bobs from the lore that you may have found confusing. There was words I had to look up this week, no doubt about it. So Mantelet refers to the lay sisters of the Dominican or Servite religious orders, most famously associated with Saint Catherine of Siena. The term derives from the distinct habit, the mantle, that they wear, and generally describes devoted religious women who perform charitable works while living in the secular community rather than strictly within cloistered convents. So when I was growing up, we actually had nuns like this all over the place in Ireland. Nuns who just lived in your town or your village or your neighborhood, and they weren't off in a convent, like kind of locked away behind closed doors, but they were just out and about and doing all kinds of stuff, helping out all over the place, things of that nature. So that kind of a nun. This was like prior to the Stigmatic nuns kind of coming in and kicking off, but this was their origin. And I think that's really kind of fun and interesting contrast, really, is like, well, maybe it's not a contrast, maybe it complements it perfectly, because these people are so willing to give, and they're willing to give even of their own flesh in the long term. So minatory it talks about the minatory gaze of the Church. That's a hugely important word in that, and it potentially hints at the fate of this this first Stigmatic nun. So the minatory, it's an adjective that means expressing or conveying a threat. So it describes actions, gestures, or tones that warn of impending danger, harm, or punishment. So this initial Stigmatic nun, she may have gotten the Church's attention, but it may not have been for good reasons. St. Catherine, it talks about how she's brought, eventually after much kind of back and forth and correspondence with Pope Agapetus III, who never existed in real life, might I add. There was a 1 and a 2 in real life, but never a third. So this is really the crux of the interest to me this week. As the story continues, it was in the darkest chamber below the Vatican that the would-be saint was brought unto the heavenly and terrible presence of the new Lamb of God. She beheld its, very importantly, its is capitalized here, divinely contorted form with rapturous awe, an arrangement of oven legs, framing a chest heaving with staccato heartbeats. So they went and did it, man. They actually tried to create the literal Lamb of God, which is wild shit. We always knew that the church was up to some crazy stuff. Not quite as out there, maybe, as some of, well, at least not as broad scale that we know of, as a lot of the stuff that the House of Wisdom gets up to, but like trying to create the actual new Lamb of God, like that concept, build it, have it be divine, is madness. And it really hints at the likely desperation of the church. And also, you have to kind of appreciate the fact that when these things occur, when these systems are in place, and when society is moving in certain directions, there will be people who are driven by their own madness and faith and lunacy and fear to do the most insane of things. And you can convince other people to give you that permission and to give you the budget that you need and the resources that you need to do it. So these guys actually did it. They produced a literal Lamb of God. This appears to have been pretty fucked up. Perfect sanguine ruin pouring from eyes across the sublime face Catherine had won in her visions. So was she seeing the Lamb? Maybe, and that is what she thought she was marrying, or more importantly, from eyes across the sublime face. Do they mean here the eyes itself? Are we like looking at a lamb with human eyes? Why is that so horrible and terrible to think about? But it is. So just like really fun, crazy lore. So this Minotaur thing is quite interesting because she got down there, she imbibed the blood, and she appears to have unleashed something into the world. The possibility kind of runs wild in Trench Crusade. Once a thing exists, it can exist elsewhere for very different reasons, if that makes sense. So she became the first of these stigmatic nuns, and then she disappeared. I have a hard time believing anybody else got down there and got to drink the blood, right? It doesn't seem hugely possible that they were able to do that. But it appears that more and more people were having this stigmata, having this, these nuns were being affected in this way. So just really interesting and really fun. Oftentimes the bits that are left out will be far more interesting than anything else. I think the church, they were conducting a form of experiment, basically. You can't have people thinking they're seeing these things, thinking they're talking to God, thinking they're marrying Jesus in their dreams, and let that run rampant. It's just not something you can do. So I'm assuming a powerful order within the church brought St. Catherine, exposed her to this experiment as part of the experiment, and it let something into the world that they weren't quite ready for. That's why they then drive away these stigmatic orders as soon as they start kind of gaining power and potential and presence. They're like, nope, can't be having you guys. You guys are just too nuts and we don't know what's happening with you. So off you go. But yeah, overall just crazy lore back to front. They mention charism, which is apparently an extraordinary divinely bestowed spiritual gift or talent granted to an individual, not for their own benefit, but to serve and build up others. So it goes back to that same origin, right, of that charitable giving. You give upon yourself, you give upon your own flesh. Now, this is the really super interesting part. Transversion Transferberation is a rare mystical grace in Catholic spirituality where an individual experiences a profound spiritual piercing of the heart. Described as an intense infusion of divine love, it is famously associated with saints like Teresa of Avila, who reported being pierced by an angel's fiery dart. Now, this stuff is all really interesting, and it's very easy to gloss over it and all the rest of it. But I'm going to do a little segue here into the concept of mental health, which ultimately is how a lot of this stuff manifests for people who are really kind of struggling, really going through intense, stressful times, will often have these visions or these moments or these imaginings. And you don't understand how powerful your mind is at feeding you signals and convincing you of things until you kind of lose control of it a little bit. It's very easy to sit there and think that you could never be convinced that you had literally experienced a physical occurrence if it had never happened to you, but that's simply untrue. Your brain controls your perception, and your perception is your reality. So this stuff I find incredibly, incredibly interesting. So it's derived from the Latin word transferberare, to pierce through. The phenomenon feels like a physical or spiritual wounding of the heart, bringing both intense pain and overwhelming sweetness. It's sometimes called the wound of love. Those who experience it describe being consumed by an unquenchable, all-encompassing love of God. It can have physical manifestations. In some cases, the spiritual piercing has reportedly left actual physical marks or internal wounds reputedly, I should say, not repeatedly. That's harder to prove. Like those apparent like physical wounds and stuff, they're all like, I saw, I said, she said, whatever. It's not like this stuff has occurred under medical observation, like you're talking about elements like Padre Pio and things like that. So there's still like a tremendous amount of faith involved. So I would have a difficult time confirming the concept of physical marks, but like I find this whole thing to be fascinating, and I love the fact that they brought it into Trench Crusade and they're exploring it there. So famous accounts of it basically are people like Padre Pio, Saint Teresa of Avila. We've discussed those. Saint Teresa describes an angel plunging a long golden flaming dart into her heart. This event is physically immortalized in Gian Lorenzo Bernini's famous Baroque sculpture, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. All these things are like tremendously important moments, and that's what a lot of these orders, these stigmatic nuns, are chasing in these moments. Now, just to kind of touch on the art, which I love, I much prefer this art to the original Stigmatic nun art. I know the concept of like nuns having their baps out and stuff is like cool for people and all, but I just really like this art quite a lot. I think it matches up quite well with the rest of the tone of Trench Crusade, and maybe I'm just not the kind of person who wants to have models of nuns with their baps out. So this suits me perfectly. Very excited. So yeah, we've got some hints at the Metachrist. This lore drop, which is absolutely dope. Everybody loves Metachrist. Not enough for us to know much about it. We know that maybe there's an implication perhaps that the written history of the Metachrist is actually quite different than what actually went down, because you've got this apparent channeling of the third Metachrist long before the third Metachrist ever exists, and that complicates things even further, because if a Metachrist can have an impact on human reality and causality before it even exists, then it gets harder and harder to track specific events and influences to relevant divine sources, if that makes sense. So they can really kind of get crazy with the Metachrist stuff now if they want to, and how history works and all that kind of stuff. It would really depend on what they want to do. Are Metachrists really just a get out of jail free card for any convoluted kind of story situations they write themselves into, or are they going to be really carefully considered foundational elements of the narrative? We still don't know, but it is what it is. So yeah, dope week. That's it for me. I'm going to stop warbling. I hope you're all having a lovely time, and thank you so much for watching. Remember to like the video only if you actually did like the video, and all the best.